member and chair of the Housing Committee. Good afternoon, Sian.
Good afternoon.
You say on your website that it is your job to make sure that Londoners feel safe in their own homes. And there are many probably this afternoon who don't, who are living in tower blocks.
Yeah, no, I think we've got about over 500,000 people in London live in blocks more than 5 stories high, and that's the point at which you start to see, increased risks when there is a fire. You have to be super careful with buildings that go over a certain height, that people can escape, that people know how to escape. And when you're talking about refurbishing and building buildings of that height, you have to make sure that they're fully fireproof. And with this tower today, it's really far too early to draw conclusions, but people were watching it happen and seeing how quickly it spread throughout the building. I don't think there's any way you can say that had the required, fire resistance. Fires should not be able to spread outside the flat in which they start within 60 minutes. That's the rule, and yet this building went up so quickly.
Yes.
It's absolutely horrific.
As we're saying, it's all speculation at the moment, so we have to be so careful. But do you think London's emergency services were sufficiently prepared for this in terms of numbers?
I think, we've seen an enormous mobilisation by the fire service here. The speed with which it took hold, I think, no amount of fire engines could really have dealt with that, and so I don't think you can complain about that at all. They're an extraordinarily hard-working and very, very brave service. We've seen firefighters going into that building as it was burning today, and I think that we should be praising them.
Absolutely. And I was listening to Vanessa, people were saying, there's lots of roadworks around that area as well, so they really had to manoeuvre to get to the scene. It's not the easiest place to get to. There are, and I've been talking to one of our listeners early on, there are Londoners who are going to remember photographs from Lakanal in 2009. And at the time, we heard that things needed to be changed, that when these refurbishments took place, that there was they were more vigilant. Did we learn anything from Lakanal, do you think?
Well, we've seen the Assembly, the London Assembly Housing and Planning Committee, looked at the risks of tall buildings immediately after that fire. They released a report in 2011. There was a full inquest into that where recommendations were made, primarily to update the building regulations and to look again at the system of inspections. Things had been changed in the past. It used to be that the Fire Authority, which the Mayor and the GLA is in London, would actually inspect proactively buildings, issue fire certificates. That was changed, so there needs to be fire risk assessments. The person responsible for the building is responsible for hiring an independent person to do those fire risk assessments. It's not clear that that's a good system. The warnings were there in the report from the Assembly and in the report from the coroner, and I think the government's been looking at making changes, but they haven't done it yet, and we've seen this tragedy today. I think it's, we shouldn't have waited.
No, and again, we had a caller saying, no, she had to alert in her block, which doesn't come under Southwark, but she had to alert the fire brigade that there were no smoke alarms in her block. That shouldn't have been, up to her. The block I live in is every week it's tested on a Tuesday afternoon. The alarm goes off. We heard residents this morning phoning the breakfast show saying, there were no alarm tests, there were no drills, there was nothing. We we've told people there were no smoke alarms, no fire alarms that seemed to be in use at all.
Yeah, no, I live I rent my flat from a private landlord. We have a, plugged-in fire alarm system. They come and test it every 3 months. They're very good. It's not clear why this wasn't the case in this block. I know that for older buildings, regulations such as having sprinklers, which there are now for taller blocks that are built new, they don't exist. But nevertheless, there should have been more activity to check that there were smoke alarms. It seems like the only ones that went off in this building were ones in private homes.
Yeah.
And they had to wake up their neighbours, and that really isn't good enough when you've got that level of risk.
And also I was saying, one of the worst things about this story is often we wake up to a story, and not that this is any better, but it's happened. We could see this happening and people being told to stay in their flats. Do you think that, I heard Ken Livingstone talking on Robert Elms, and he said, that on 9/11, that's what they were being told. Maybe that's the wrong advice, do you think?
It is really difficult because, if you evacuate an entire block every time there's a fire, a small one in every flat, you're actually introducing more risks than exist. The theory is that the flats should be fireproof for 60 minutes, which should be plenty of time for the fire service to turn up, to make an assessment and decide whether or not to evacuate. That's really what that's about.
Yeah.
But I think just saying to people, stay in your flat no matter what, it should be stay in your flat and get further advice as quickly as possible.
You're quite right. I mean, Jason Rossum, who one of our reporters came back, he said that he'd been interviewing someone who had tried to get onto the fire escape and yet there was stuff falling down, you know. So the exits, you know, none of them were safe, to be quite honest. But there are fire doors in that block, and it makes you wonder why they didn't hold the fire back somewhat, at least from floor to floor.
That's right. I mean, it's a concrete block. There should be fire resistance between flats. All flats now have to have fire doors fitted. Even older blocks, they're going in all the older blocks. There isn't really a reason I can see, apart from sort of faulty works, although, you know, let's not conclude anything yet, for the fire to spread as quickly as it did. And that's the reason that some of the fire escapes were blocked, is because it had taken hold so quickly.
And as you say, it's concrete blocks. Does that mean then it is safe? I mean, do you even know that? Because the major concern is that the whole thing could now come down. But I heard somebody reporting that because of the concrete, it's probably safer.
I'm not a building engineer, so I cannot comment on that, I'm afraid. I think, you know, we are talking about, you know, the inspection regime. You know, these blocks should be able to be made safe. There are methods to make them safe. They are written down in building codes. It's the question of checking whether that's done, whether that's kept up to date. Obviously, when you've got council blocks as well, quite often people have bought individual homes. You've got right to buy homes.
So you've got mixed
and their
ownership.
own DIY construction techniques can have an effect on fire safety, and that needs inspecting too, and somebody needs to be proactively checking these things, and that's not what the current regulations ask for.
Again, I don't know whether you're qualified to answer this, but my dad was a quantity surveyor, and this block was built in the 70s. I remember my dad saying, you know, a lot of these blocks contain asbestos. This is, again, I heard Ken Livingston mention this on the previous show, the concerns that could be floating all over the place. Do you know any more about that?
Certainly, I mean, asbestos was used as a fire safety measure in a lot of buildings of that age, so I wouldn't be at all surprised.
And as I said, just looking at the statistics, we have more high-rise flats in this city than anywhere else in the UK. They represent just over half the capital's accommodation. Do you think that's a trend? I mean, OK, we're overcrowded, we're living literally on top of each other. Do you think that that's a trend that's going to have to stop, or do you think that, you know, vigilance is the answer?
Well, certainly, I mean, very high-rise blocks are starting to become more of a norm. I'm a councillor in Camden as well as a London Assembly member, and in King's Cross we're seeing, you know, tall buildings, you know, 50 metres and above going up there, in which people live. They're new buildings. They should be well protected. And I think it is a trend. But I mean, certainly we do need to be building at density in London, and we're talking about blocks of 5 or 7 stories high. Those are risky places to live from a fire perspective as well. It's all about the quality, all about making sure people know what to do when there is a fire, and checking that things are done right.
So just to sum up then, Sian Berry, for all our listeners, many of whom are living in tower blocks or indeed blocks of flats, who are concerned, what should they do?
I think the first thing they need to do is make sure that they know and that their landlord has given them good information on what to do in the event of a fire, and that they're aware of it and that all their family are aware of it. I think that's the first thing people can do. We do have, you know, checking the fire risk assessment that was done for their blocks, you know, proactively going out and asking their council, their landlord, the questions that they have. People are bound to have questions, and it's your landlord and your council's responsibility to answer those. So I would say go and ask the questions, because you're right.
Loads of people emailing in. This is from Stuart, who says, this is such sad news. I'm lucky enough, to own my own flat, but there are many buildings like mine where there are people who are in local authority accommodation. They really do need looking at. There are many freehold landlords that don't do maintenance to their buildings.
That's a problem I've looked at myself as part of the work I've done, standing for mayor and being a candidate and all of that. I've asked renters about their private landlords, and lots of people do rent from landlords who own former right-to-buy flats. And one of the chief complaints they gave me was maintenance and things like damp, things like drafty windows. You know, these are also things that can let a fire spread. So let's check this out, and let's get higher quality in our housing in general is something that we can learn from this.
Sian Berry, Green Party London Assembly member and chair of the Housing Committee, thank you so much for joining us on the afternoon show.